People used to tell me I could fix anything except a bad attitude, and for most of my life I took that as a compliment. I've been an electrician for 34 years, and somewhere along the way, that turned into being the guy everybody in the family called when something broke, when something didn't add up, or when nobody else wanted to deal with it. I never minded. There's a kind of peace in knowing exactly what you're good for. My wife Carol used to joke that I had two speeds, working and sleeping, and she wasn't wrong, though she left out the part where most of that working was, for people who never once said thank you and never once needed to. That was the deal I made with myself a long time ago, long before I understood what it would cost me. I built the front door of our house myself, back when Carol and I bought the place, and it still smelled like somebody else's cooking. It's a simple door, nothing fancy, but I hung it plumb and true, and it's never once stuck in 20 years, not in the summer heat, and not when the wood swells up in a wet spring. I mention that door because I want you to understand what it meant to me later, when I found myself standing on the other side of it, with nothing in my hands but my truck keys. But that's getting ahead of things. Back then, it was just a door I was proud of, the kind of small thing a man carries around without ever saying it out loud. My toolbox lives by that door, has for years. It's scuffed up, and the latch on one side doesn't quite catch anymore, but I've never replaced it, because a man gets attached to the things that have been through as much as he has. Carol used to trip over it in the mornings and swear at it good-naturedly, and I'd promise to move it and never quite get around to it. Little routines like that are what a marriage is actually made of, I think. Not the big anniversary dinners. The tripping over a toolbox for 20 years and both of you laughing about it anyway. We had a system in our family, one I'd helped build a long time ago and never asked for credit for. After Carol's father had his heart scare years back, and the whole family scrambled to cover the hospital bills with nothing set aside, we started an emergency fund together, the kind of thing meant to catch anybody in the family who fell. Carol and I put money into it every month without fail. Her brother Greg had signing access too as a backup in case something happened to Carol or me and somebody needed to move fast. It was never something anybody thought twice about. Greg was family. You don't audit family. I want to be honest with you about something. I liked being the one who quietly kept things running. When Carol's mother Ellen needed her gutters cleared, I did it before she even finished asking. When Marcus, our son, needed help understanding his mortgage paperwork, I sat with him at his kitchen table until midnight going through it line by line. When the fund needed replenishing after some family expense, I was usually the one who topped it back up without making a production of it. I never once thought of myself as a martyr. I thought of myself as a man doing what a man is supposed to do for the people he loves. It never occurred to me that quiet competence could be mistaken for something else entirely, or that being the one who never causes trouble could someday make me the easiest one to blame when trouble showed up. That Sunday started, like every other Sunday had for the better part of 30 years. Carol made her pot roast, the one with too much rosemary, that nobody had the heart to tell her was too much rosemary. Marcus came by with his laptop bag still over his shoulder, like he'd driven straight from the office, which he probably had. Ellen sat in her usual chair, the one closest to the window, complaining about her hip in the same good-natured way she'd complained about it for a decade. And Greg showed up a little later than everyone else, the way Greg always did, with that easy smile of his that never seemed to cost him anything. I noticed it before I understood it, the way you notice a change in weather before you can name what's coming. Greg was quieter than usual through most of dinner, picking at his plate, glancing at his phone, more than a man should at a family meal. I didn't think much of it. Business ebbs and flows, and everybody around that table knew his landscaping company had been through a rough patch or two over the years. It wasn't until we were clearing plates, until Carol was rinsing dishes and I was drying, that Greg leaned against the counter with his arms crossed and said, in a voice that was trying very hard to sound casual, that he'd noticed some concerning withdrawals from the family fund. I remember exactly how Carol's face changed. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't drop a dish or gasp or anything you'd expect from a moment like that. It was smaller than that, and somehow worse. Her hands went still in the sink water, and she looked at me. Not at Greg, at me, with an expression I hadn't seen in 28 years of marriage. something between confusion and the first faint edge of doubt. I didn't know yet what withdrawals he meant, or what he thought he'd found, or why he was choosing to bring it up like this, in passing, over dish soap, instead of calling me directly like a grown man would. I only knew that something had just shifted in my own kitchen, and that, whatever it was aimed at me. The water was still running when Carol finally shut it off, and the sudden quiet in the kitchen felt heavier than the sound had been. Greg didn't say anything else right away. He just stood there with his arms crossed, letting the words he'd dropped sit in the room and do their work, which I'd come to understand later was exactly the kind of thing Greg was good at, saying just enough to plant a seed and then stepping back to watch it grow on its own. Carol dried her hands slowly on the dish towel, folding it in a way that told me she was buying herself a few seconds to think, and then she asked him, quiet, what he meant. Greg said he'd glanced at the account a few weeks back, just checking in the way he sometimes did, and noticed some withdrawals he didn't recognize, timed close to some of the invoices from my recent contract jobs. He said it careful. The way a man says something when he wants you to draw your own conclusion, without him ever having to state it outright. He never once said I'd taken money. He didn't have to. He just laid the pieces next to each other and let Carol connect them herself. And I watched her do it right there in front of me, watched her mind start working through a story that had nothing to do with the truth. I should tell you about that invoice, because it matters. A few months earlier, I'd taken on a big rewiring job for a family down the road, the kind of job that pays well but takes weeks to actually get paid for, since the homeowner's insurance had to process everything first. I'd fronted some of the material costs myself in the meantime, the way I sometimes did for bigger jobs, planning to square it away once the check came through. It was ordinary. It was the kind of thing I'd done a dozen times over the years without anybody blinking. But laid next to Greg's vague mention of unrecognized withdrawals, at a moment when nobody in that kitchen had the full picture, it looked like something else entirely. I told Carol plainly that I didn't know what he was talking about, that I hadn't touched the fund outside of putting money into it, same as always. I could hear how steady my own voice sounded, which surprised me, because underneath it I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a kind of quiet alarm, the sense of ground shifting under a house you thought was built on rock. Greg said, easy as anything, that he wasn't accusing anybody. He just thought somebody should look into it before it became a bigger problem, and there it was again. That trick of his, saying the reasonable thing while doing the unreasonable thing, wrapping the whole business in a tone so mild that anybody pushing back too hard would look like the one overreacting. Ellen came into the kitchen right about then, drawn by the change in the air the way mothers always are. And she didn't ask what was going on so much as she seemed to already know, or at least already have an opinion ready. She put a hand on Carol's arm and said something about how money makes people do strange things, and how it was probably nothing. Best not to make a scene at Sunday dinner. I noticed, though I didn't have the words for it yet, that she never once looked at me while she said it. She looked at Carol the whole time, like she was steering her somewhere. Marcus, to his credit, stood in the doorway watching the whole thing with the kind of narrowed, careful attention I recognized from when he was a boy, trying to figure out if I was really mad or just pretending to be. He didn't say much that night. He wasn't in a position to yet, but I caught him glancing at Greg in a way that told me he wasn't buying the story quite as easily as everybody else seemed to be, and I held on to that small thing without fully understanding why I needed to. The days after that Sunday were quiet in the wrong way, the kind of quiet where everybody's being careful around everybody else. Carol didn't bring it up again right away, and for a few days I let myself believe it might just fade, the way small family frictions sometimes do if you don't feed them. I kept working. I kept doing the things I always did, fixing what needed fixing, showing up where I was needed, because that had always been my answer to trouble, to just keep being useful and let the usefulness speak for itself. I didn't yet understand that usefulness isn't the same thing as trust, and that a man can spend 30 years proving himself and still lose the benefit of the doubt in a single conversation if the story told about him is convincing enough and told by the right person. It was a Thursday evening when Carol finally sat me down at our kitchen table, the same table we'd eaten 1,000 dinners at and told me she'd looked into it herself, or thought she had, going over some numbers Greg had printed out for her. She said, the timing lined up too well to be a coincidence. I tried to explain about the rewiring job, about fronting the material costs, about the insurance check that hadn't come through yet, and I watched her listen to me, the way you listen to someone you're trying to believe, but can't quite manage to. She wasn't cruel about it. That's the part that stayed with me longest. That she wasn't cruel. She was just certain, in a way that felt worse than cruelty, because certainty like that doesn't leave much room for a man to argue his way back in. She said maybe I should just apologize, own up to it, make it right with the family, and we could move past it. And something in me, something that had been quiet and patient for a very long time, finally had enough. I looked at her across that table, the same table where I'd helped Marcus with his math homework, and where Carol and I had planned our whole life together in pencil on the backs of envelopes. And I told her I wasn't going to apologize for something I didn't do. I said it calm, because I've never been a man who raises his voice, but I meant it in a way I hadn't meant many things in my life. She said if I couldn't just say I was sorry, for the sake of the family, then maybe I should think about whether I even wanted to be part of this family right now. I don't think she meant it exactly the way it came out. I've turned that thought over more times than I can count since then. But meant or not, that's what she said. And once words like that are out in a kitchen, you can't call them back in. I want to explain something about my own father, because it matters here. He was a good man, my dad, a machinist his whole life. Quiet in the same way I am, maybe quieter. When I was around 12, his younger brother borrowed money from their mother without telling anybody. And when it came time to pay it back and he didn't, somehow the story that took hold in the family was that my father was the one who'd taken it. I watched my father sit through Thanksgiving dinners for years after that, taking sideways comments and cold shoulders from relatives who believed a story that wasn't true, and he never once corrected it. He told me once, years later, that he just didn't think it was worth the fight, that keeping the peace mattered more to him than being understood. I loved my father, I still do, even though he's been gone 11 years now, but I made myself a promise. Sitting in church, pews next to him as a boy, watching him swallow something that wasn't his to swallow, that I would never do what he did. I would never let silence be mistaken for guilt, just to keep somebody else comfortable. So I stood up from that table, and I didn't argue anymore, because there wasn't anywhere left for the argument to go. I walked to the front door, my front door, the one I'd hung plumb and true 20 years earlier, and I picked up my toolbox out of habit more than anything, though I set it back down almost immediately, because some part of me understood that if I took it, I'd be admitting I wasn't planning to come back anytime soon, and I wasn't ready to admit that yet, not even to myself. I took my truck keys instead. Carol didn't follow me to the door. I heard her sit back down at the table behind me, and the sound of that, of her staying seated instead of coming after me, told me more than anything she'd said out loud. I drove to Marcus's place without really deciding to. It was just where the truck seemed to want to go. 20 minutes across town to the little rental house he'd been fixing up on weekends, the kind of place a young man buys when he's trying to prove something to himself. He opened the door in sweatpants, looking confused for a second before his face changed. The way a son's face changes when he realizes his father showing up unannounced at 9 at night isn't a social visit. He didn't ask a lot of questions right away. He just stepped back and let me in, and put on a pot of coffee neither one of us really wanted, just for something to do with our hands. I told him what happened, as plain as I could manage, without much editorializing. Marcus listened the way he always has, quiet and careful, the same look on his face he used to get as a boy when he was working through a math problem he didn't want to get wrong. When I got to the part about the invoice, about Greg's mention of unrecognized withdrawals, something shifted in his expression, something I couldn't quite place at first. He said, slow, like he was choosing his words carefully, that he'd actually glanced at some of the fund statements a while back, helping Ellen set up online banking, and that a couple of the numbers hadn't quite made sense to him at the time, though he hadn't thought much of it since it wasn't really his business to go digging through. He said it almost like an afterthought, but I felt something settle in my chest when he said it, a small, cautious kind of relief, the first crack of light in what had otherwise been a very dark evening. That night I slept, or tried to, on Marcus's pull-out couch, staring up at a ceiling fan that wobbled slightly on every rotation, thinking about my father, about the door I'd hung, about the toolbox I'd left behind on purpose. I thought about how strange it was that a man could spend 3 decades being useful to people and still end up, on one ordinary Thursday, sitting in his son's guest room with nothing but the clothes on his back and the truck he drove over in. I didn't know yet what Marcus had really noticed in those statements, or how far it would end up leading, but I knew I wasn't going to spend this particular fight the way my father had spent his. I wasn't going to stay quiet just to keep the peace. Somewhere in that decision, uncomfortable as it was, I found something that felt almost like solid ground again, even in the middle of losing everything familiar. Back at the house, though I wasn't there to see it firsthand until later, when Carol finally told me the truth of those days, things weren't settling the way anybody expected them to. Carol has told me since, more than once, that the house felt different with me, gone in a way she hadn't braced herself. For she said she went to fix a dripping pipe under the kitchen sink. The second morning, something I would have handled without either of us ever discussing it, and found herself standing there with a wrench in her hand, staring at a mess of pipes. She didn't understand, feeling foolish and something worse than foolish. She said it wasn't really about the pipe. It was the sudden realization of how many small things I'd been quietly managing that she'd never had to think about, let alone learn to do herself. Ellen came by that second day, ostensibly to check on Carol, though Carol told me later she got the distinct sense her mother had come, for another reason entirely. Ellen sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen where everything had unraveled, and steered the conversation gently but firmly back toward reassurance, telling Carol she'd done the right thing, that a man ought to be able to own up to his mistakes, that families sometimes needed a little shake-up to remember what mattered. Carol told me she remembers thinking, even in the middle of her own hurt and confusion, that something about the way her mother kept circling back to the subject felt less like comfort and more like management, though she couldn't have said why at the time. It was later that same afternoon that Carol finally asked Greg directly, plainly, whether he was certain about what he'd seen in the fund statements, whether he'd actually looked closely or just noticed something that looked off from a distance. She told me Greg's answer surprised her, not because of what he said, but because of how long it took him to say it. He hesitated, just a beat too long before saying he was pretty sure that he could pull up the exact numbers if she wanted, though he never did pull them up, not that day, and found some reason to change the subject shortly after. Carol didn't think much of the hesitation in the moment. She told me later that it was only looking back that she understood what she'd actually witnessed, which was a man buying himself time he didn't know how to use. I want to tell you that Carol started doubting the story right then and there, but that's not honest, and I promised myself I'd tell this the way it actually happened, not the way that would make me look better in it. The truth is, she was still mostly certain I'd done something wrong. 28 years of marriage doesn't unravel a story in one hesitant conversation. What had shifted, though, was smaller and quieter than doubt, more like an itch she couldn't quite scratch, a small nagging sense that something about the whole situation didn't sit right, even if she couldn't yet say what. Meanwhile, I was doing my best to keep working, because a man's got bills whether his marriage is falling apart or not, and there's a certain mercy in having somewhere to put your hands and your attention when your mind is somewhere else entirely. I took a job that second day rewiring a detached garage for a young couple across town, and I remember standing on a ladder running conduit, thinking about Carol's face at that kitchen table when my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. It just said he wanted to talk when I got a chance, nothing urgent sounding. But something in the plainness of it made my stomach tighten anyway. When I called him that evening, he told me he'd asked Ellen, casual as anything, if he could take a closer look at the fund statements to help her understand the online banking better, which wasn't exactly a lie, since he had helped her with that before. She'd agreed without much thought, and he'd spent a good part of the afternoon going through the last 2 years of transactions, comparing dates and amounts against what he remembered of family expenses. He told me there were withdrawals, small ones, a few $100s here, a few hundred there, spread out over many months. That didn't match up with anything he could account for. He said it careful, the way he says most things, not wanting to accuse anybody outright before he had more to go on. But I could hear something steady and determined underneath the caution, the sound of a son who wasn't going to let this rest until he understood it fully. I asked him if he'd found anything about my invoice, the one Greg had pointed to that Sunday. Marcus went quiet for a second and then told me that as far as he could tell, that particular transaction wasn't a withdrawal at all. It was a deposit. I'd put money into the fund around that same time, not taken it out. Something Marcus said made no sense next to what Greg had implied at dinner. I sat with that for a long moment after we hung up, turning it over, feeling something complicated move through me. Not quite vindication yet. More like the first thin light before a sunrise, the sense that the true shape of things was finally starting to show itself, even if I still couldn't see all of it clearly. Marcus called me back 2 evenings later, and I could hear in his voice before he said much of anything that he'd found more than he expected to. He'd spent the better part of that day going line by line through 18 months of statements, cross-referencing dates against family expenses he could remember, holiday gifts, Ellen's dental work, the roof repair after the bad storm 2 summers back, anything that might explain the gaps. What he found instead was a pattern, small round number withdrawals, 200 here, 350 there, spaced out just unevenly enough that nobody glancing casually would notice a rhythm to them, but close together enough once you laid them all out that the rhythm became impossible to miss. He told me the withdrawals had started a little over a year and a half ago, and that once he saw the pattern, he couldn't stop seeing it the same way you can't unsee a shape. Once somebody points it out to you in a cloud. I asked him what he thought it meant, though I think some part of me already suspected the answer and just needed to hear somebody else say it first. He said he didn't want to accuse anybody without being certain, but that the only person besides Carol and me with signing access to that account was Greg, and that the timing of the withdrawals lined up a little too closely with some things he'd heard secondhand about Greg's landscaping business struggling. I hadn't known much about the state of Greg's business, if I'm honest. Family doesn't always share that kind of thing openly, especially not a man like Greg, who'd built his whole personality around looking like things came easy to him. But Marcus mentioned that he'd run into one of Greg's old crew members a few months back at a hardware store, and the man had mentioned, in that offhand way people do, that he hadn't worked for Greg in almost a year, that most of the equipment had been sold off or was sitting idle in the yard behind Greg's shop. At the time, Marcus hadn't thought much of it. Now it sat differently in his mind. I told Marcus I wasn't ready to say anything to Greg directly. Not yet. Not without being sure, because if I was wrong about this, if I let my own hurt convince me of something that wasn't true, I'd be doing to Greg exactly what had been done to me, and I couldn't stomach that kind of hypocrisy even in the middle of my own anger. Marcus agreed, though I could tell it cost him some patience to sit on what he'd found. He's always been that way, methodical, careful, wanting to have every number checked twice before he says a word out loud, which is probably why he's good at his job and probably why he's the one who ended up finding the truth in the first place. What Marcus didn't know yet, what none of us knew yet, was that Greg's business troubles had gotten considerably worse over those past few months, worse than a slow season, worse than the kind of dip any small business owner rides out with some patience and a tightened belt. I'd learn later that Greg had 2 pieces of equipment repossessed that spring, that he'd been juggling a business loan payment he was behind on for the better part of a year, and that the withdrawals Marcus had found weren't the beginning of Greg's trouble. They were a symptom of trouble that had been building for a long time before anybody in the family noticed anything was wrong. I spent that night on Marcus's pull-out couch again, staring at the same wobbling ceiling fan, thinking about how strange it was that Greg had sat across from me at Sunday dinners for 15 years, had held Marcus as a baby, had stood up as a groomsman at somebody's wedding. I couldn't even remember who's right then, and I'd never once seen the man underneath the easy smile, the one apparently drowning quietly enough that nobody around that table noticed. I didn't feel triumphant finding this out. I want to be honest about that. I felt something closer to sad. a heaviness that sat right alongside the relief of maybe finally being believed again. 2 days after that call, Marcus mentioned he gently brought up the fund statements to his mother, careful not to tip his hand too far, just asking if she'd ever double-check the numbers herself. He said Carol had gone quiet on the phone for a long moment and then admitted, in a small voice, he said he'd never heard from her before, that she hadn't checked anything, she just trusted what she'd been told. He said there was something in the way she said it, like she already understood. Somewhere underneath everything, that trusting what she'd been told and knowing the truth might turn out to be two very different things. I didn't know it yet, sitting in my son's guest room with my toolbox, still 20 minutes away. By the front door, I'd hung with my own 2 hands, but the ground back at that house had already begun, quietly, to shift. Carol told me later that it was around this time she started noticing Greg differently. The way you notice a familiar room differently once somebody's told you there's a crack in the foundation somewhere beneath it. He called her twice in the space of 3 days, which wasn't like him. Greg had never been much of a phone caller, always more comfortable dropping by in person when he wanted something, or catching people at family gatherings where the conversation could stay light and easy. These calls weren't light. Carol said he spent most of both of them reassuring her that everything with the fund was fine, that he was on top of it, that she shouldn't let herself get too worked up over what was probably just some accounting confusion that would sort itself out. She said the strange part wasn't what he said so much as how much of it he said. Greg had never been a man to explain himself at length about anything. He was the type to make a joke and change the subject, to let things roll off him with that easy shrug of his, and here he was calling twice unprompted, walking her through explanations nobody had asked for, offering to pull up statements he then found reasons not to actually produce. Carol told me she sat with the phone against her ear the second time he called and thought, almost against her own will, that a man with nothing to hide doesn't usually work this hard to convince you he has nothing to hide. I wasn't there for any of this directly, but Marcus kept me updated most evenings, the two of us talking low on the phone after he thought his mother had gone to bed, like a couple of conspirators, though neither of us much liked feeling that way about our own family. It was Marcus who finally drove out to Greg's equipment yard, on the pretense of borrowing a trailer hitch he didn't actually need, just to see for himself what was really going on. He told me it was worse than the old crew member's comment had suggested. Half the yard sat empty, where trucks and mowers used to line up in neat rows. What was left looked tired, some of it up on blocks, one trailer with a flat tire that had clearly been flat for months. Greg met him at the gate, instead of letting him walk back to where the equipment sat, which Marcus said felt less like hospitality and more like a man steering a visitor away from something. I thought a lot during those days about Ellen, and about the particular way she'd shown up in that kitchen on the very first night this all started, steering Carol so gently and so quickly toward believing the worst about me. I'd always known Ellen favored Greg, the way some mothers do with a son who reminds them of themselves, or maybe of a husband long gone. I never knew the whole story there. I'd accepted it, the way you accept most things about your in-laws, without much examination, filed under things that are simply true about people and not worth fighting over. But turning it over now, in light of everything Marcus had found, I started to wonder if what I'd always read as simple favoritism might have actually been something closer to fear, an old, tired kind of fear a mother carries when she suspects her child is capable of something and has spent years quietly working to keep anybody else from seeing it too. I didn't have long to sit with that thought before everything accelerated past anything I could have predicted. It was a Tuesday, 10 days after I'd walked out my own front door, when Carol called me directly for the first time since that night. Her voice sounded different, thin in a way I hadn't heard from her in years, and she told me Ellen's medical bill, the follow-up from a procedure on her hip she'd had scheduled for months, had come due, a payment that should have drawn easily and without issue from the very fund we'd built for exactly this kind of thing. It hadn't gone through. The fund didn't have enough to cover it. Carol said there was a strange, terrible silence on the phone when the bank first told Ellen, a silence that stretched out over that whole side of the family as the reality of it settled in. Because that account had never once come up short in all the years since we'd started it. Not through Marcus's college expenses, not through 2 separate roof repairs, not through anything, not until now. I asked her, careful how short they were, and she named a number that made something cold settle low in my stomach, because it was close enough to the sum of every strange withdrawal Marcus had found that there was no explaining it away anymore, not as confusion, not as an accounting error, not as anything except exactly what it was. I told Carol I was sorry, and I meant it. Sorry for Ellen. Sorry for all of them, even though some small, tired part of me couldn't help but notice that the truth I'd been asking everyone to simply consider for 10 days had just kicked the front door down on its own, without any help from me at all. Carol told me she drove straight to Greg's place after the bank called, not stopping to think it through the way she usually did with hard conversations, just getting in the car with her mother's medical bill sitting unpaid and a decade and a half of quiet unease finally catching up to her all at once. She said she didn't even knock. Just walked in through the side door the way family always had in that house and found Greg's sitting at his kitchen table with a stack of his own bills spread out in front of him. The kind of mess a man makes when he stopped opening things the day they arrive and started opening them only when he absolutely has to. She said he didn't try to hide the papers when she walked in, which told her something all on its own. A man with nothing to hide doesn't flinch at being seen, and a man too far past hiding doesn't have the energy left to bother either. She asked him straight out, no more careful phrasing, no more room for him to deflect the way he had for weeks, whether he'd been the one taking money from the fund. Carol told me the silence that followed felt like it lasted longer than it actually did. Greg just sitting there with his hand flat on the table, looking for the first time in her memory like a much smaller man than the one who'd always filled up a room without trying. He didn't deny it outright. Carol said that was almost the hardest part, that he didn't even put up a real fight, just started explaining, the words coming out fast and tangled, about the business loan he'd fallen behind on, about equipment payments piling up faster than jobs were coming in, about how he'd told himself the first withdrawal was temporary, just to cover one bad month, and how he'd meant to pay it back before anybody noticed. And then there was another bad month and another, and somewhere in there paying it back stopped feeling like a plan and started feeling like a thing he'd deal with someday, in some version of the future where his business turned around, and none of this ever had to come to light. Carol asked him, and she told me, her voice barely held together asking it, how he could have let all of this land on me instead. She said. Greg went quiet again at that, longer this time, and when he finally answered, he didn't have much of an excuse worth repeating. Something about panicking when Marcus started asking questions, about seeing an opening when he noticed my invoice sitting there in the statements, looking out of context, like something it wasn't, and taking it without letting himself think too hard about what he was doing to me in the process. He told her he was sorry, and Carol said she believed that he meant it in the small, useless way a man means something after he's already done the damage and has run out of road to keep running from it. I want to tell you I felt something satisfying in that moment when Carol told me all of this over the phone, some clean sense of being proven right after 10 days of carrying it alone. That's not quite what I felt. What I felt was closer to grief. An old, familiar kind, the same shape as watching my father sit through those Thanksgivings years ago, carrying blame that wasn't his, except this time I'd been the one carrying it. And now I was hearing about a man I'd trusted for 15 years finally admitting he'd let me carry it on purpose, because it was easier than facing what he'd done himself. Ellen found out that same evening, and Carol told me later that whatever she'd suspected, however long she'd sensed something wasn't right, and chosen to steer everyone gently away from looking too closely, hearing it confirmed out loud in her own son's kitchen broke something in her that Carol hadn't ever seen break before. Ellen didn't defend him, not that night. She just sat down hard in one of Greg's kitchen chairs and put her face in her hands, and when she finally spoke, it wasn't to excuse him. It was to say, quiet and stunned, that she'd been so afraid this was true for so long that she hadn't let herself really look, because looking would have meant doing something about it, and she hadn't known what that something was supposed to be. Carol called me that night from her car outside Greg's house, sitting alone in the dark with the engine off, and she didn't try to explain any of it away or soften it for my sake. She just told me, plainly, that she'd been wrong, completely wrong, and that she understood now what she'd actually done to me by believing a story, before she'd bothered to check whether it was true. I didn't say much back. I wasn't ready to yet, and some old, careful part of me was still waiting to see what she'd do with that understanding now that she had it, whether it would turn into something real or just fade the way uncomfortable realizations sometimes do once the immediate crisis passes. But I told her I was glad Ellen's bill would get sorted, and that I was glad the truth was finally out where everybody could see it, and underneath those small, practical words was something bigger. I wasn't quite ready to say out loud yet either. Carol didn't sleep much that night, or so she told me later, sitting up long after she'd gotten home from Greg's house, turning the whole thing over in a way she said felt less like anger now, and more like grief for time she couldn't get back. She said she kept thinking about the Thursday she'd sat me down at our own kitchen table and asked me to just apologize, to just make it easy for everybody, and how she hadn't stopped once during that conversation to ask herself what it would cost me to say, sorry for something I hadn't done, only what it would cost the family if I didn't. She called Marcus first thing the next morning, not me, and I understood why later, though it stung a little at the time before I understood it. She needed to hear from somebody who'd actually looked at the numbers, who could walk her through exactly what he'd found, and because some part of her still needed the facts laid out plainly before she trusted her own judgment again. Marcus told her everything, the pattern of withdrawals, the timeline, the invoice, that had actually been a deposit. All of it. And he told me afterward that his mother had gone very quiet on the phone, and then asked him, in a voice he said he'd never heard from her before, whether I knew that he'd been investigating this whole time. He told her the truth, that I'd known, that I'd asked him to be sure before either of us said anything to anybody, because I hadn't wanted to accuse Greg the same way I'd been accused. Without proof, without giving him the benefit of the doubt, I'd been denied myself. Carol told me later that, hearing that undid her a little. The idea that, even after everything, even sitting alone in his guest room with nothing but his truck keys, I'd still been careful not to do to someone else what had been done to me. She said it wasn't the kind of thing you can manufacture in a person after the fact. Either a man is built that way underneath everything or he isn't. And she said she'd known that about me for 28 years and had somehow still let herself forget it under enough pressure from people who should have known better than to apply it. She didn't call me again that day. I noticed the silence, and some worn-down part of me almost expected it to stretch on the way these things sometimes do, everybody circling their own hurts separately instead of finding their way back toward each other. But late that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus instead, just a handful of words, telling me his mother was on her way over to his place, and that I might want to be ready for that. I was standing in his kitchen when I heard her car pull into the driveway, and I remember my hands going still on the counter, the same stillness I'd watched settle over her own hands in our kitchen sink weeks earlier, right before all of this started. There's something strange about waiting for somebody you've loved for almost 3 decades to walk through a door, not knowing exactly what version of them is about to appear on the other side of it. I didn't go to the door. I let Marcus answer it, and I stood back, giving her whatever room she needed to come to me instead of the other way around, because some quiet, stubborn part of me still remembered that she hadn't come after me the night I left. And some part of me needed her to be the one crossing that particular distance this time. She came into the kitchen slowly, and I could see she'd been crying at some point that day, not dramatically, just the kind of quiet crying that leaves a person's eyes a little swollen and their voice a little rough around the edges. She didn't launch into an explanation right away. She just stood there for a moment, looking at me the way you look at somebody you're trying to see clearly again after a long time of looking at them through somebody else's story instead of your own eyes. Then she said, my name, just that, and something in the way she said, it told me more than any speech could have, that she wasn't there to defend herself, or to smooth things over quickly so everybody could get back to normal. She was there because she'd finally understood what she'd actually done, and she didn't know yet whether there was a way back from it, only that she had to try, and that trying meant showing up in person in my son's kitchen without any guarantee of how I'd respond. I pulled out one of Marcus's mismatched kitchen chairs and sat down across from her, the same way we'd sat across from each other at our own table 2 weeks earlier. Except everything about the distance between us felt different now, quieter, less certain of itself. Carol sat down too, and for a moment neither of us said anything. The two of us just sitting there in my son's kitchen, like a couple of strangers trying to remember how a conversation was supposed to work between people who'd built an entire life together. She started by saying she was sorry, and I want to tell you that it didn't come wrapped in excuses. The way apologies sometimes do when a person is more interested in feeling better about themselves than in actually reckoning with what they did. She said she was sorry for believing Greg and her mother over me without ever once picking up the phone to ask me to walk her through it myself, calmly, away from the noise of a family dinner. She said she was sorry for handing me an ultimatum instead of asking a question, for choosing what felt easier in the moment over what she actually knew to be true about the kind of man I'd always been. I didn't rush to tell her it was all right, because it wasn't, not yet, and I'd promised myself somewhere back on Marcus's pull-out couch that I wasn't going to smooth things over just to make the discomfort end faster, the way my father always had. Instead, I asked her the question that had been sitting in my chest for 2 weeks, the one that mattered more to me than any apology could on its own. I asked her why it took the fund actually failing, why it took her own mother's bill bouncing, for her to finally go looking for the truth herself when I'd been telling her the truth the whole time, for free, at our own kitchen table, before any of this became a crisis big enough to force her hand. Carol sat with that question for a long moment before she answered, and I could see it cost her something to sit with it honestly instead of reaching for the easiest answer available. She said she thought, if she was being truthful with herself, that it had always been simpler to believe the version of events that didn't ask anything hard of her, the version where she didn't have to stand between her husband and her own brother, where she didn't have to disappoint her mother, where the family stayed comfortable, even if the comfort was built on something false. She said she'd spent so many years being the peacekeeper in that family, the one who smoothed things over and kept everybody at the same table, that she'd stopped noticing when peacekeeping had quietly turned into looking away. I told her about my father then, really told her, more than I think I ever had in almost 30 years of marriage. About watching him carry blame that wasn't his for the sake of everybody else's comfort, and about the promise I'd made myself as a boy that I would never let that happen to me, not even for her, not even for the family we'd built together. I told her that walking out that door hadn't been about punishing her. It had been about keeping a promise to myself that I'd been keeping quietly for 34 years without ever having to test it until now. She reached across the table then and put her hand over mine, and I let her, though I didn't close my fingers around hers right away. Not yet. She said she understood now, in a way she hadn't let herself understand before, that being loved by me had never meant I'd stay quiet no matter what was done to me, and that some part of her had been leaning on that quietness for years without ever really seeing it as something I was choosing to give her, rather than something she was simply owed. She said she didn't want a marriage built on that kind of quiet anymore. Not because she didn't trust me, but because she finally understood what it had cost me to keep giving it. We talked for a long while after that, longer than we'd talked plainly to each other, and longer than I wanted to admit. About Greg, about what came next for him, about Ellen and the strange, tired fear that had shaped so much of how she'd handled things without either of us fully understanding it until now. We didn't solve everything that evening in Marcus's kitchen. Some things don't get solved in a single conversation, no matter how honest it is. But something between us shifted back into place that night, not exactly the way it had been before, because I don't think either of us wanted it to go back to exactly how it had been before. Something steadier, maybe. Something built a little more carefully this time, out of the kind of honesty that only shows up once you've already lost something and are trying together to figure out how to get it back the right way. I drove back to the house 2 days later, and I want to tell you that it felt like a triumphant homecoming the kind you'd see in a movie, but it wasn't that. And I think that's exactly why it worked. Carol had asked me to come home on my own timing, whenever I was ready, not before, and I appreciated that more than she probably knew, because it meant the choice was mine again, freely made, instead of something I was talked back into out of guilt or convenience. My toolbox was still sitting by the front door, exactly where I'd left it, and there was something almost funny about that. Walking back through the door I'd hung with my own hands 2 decades earlier, and finding the one thing I'd deliberately left behind, waiting patiently right where I'd set it down. I picked it up and carried it back inside, and Carol watched me do it from the kitchen doorway without saying anything, though I saw something ease in her shoulders when she saw me set it down in its old spot, like some small piece of the world had quietly clicked back into place. Greg came by a week later on his own, without Ellen there to soften anything or steer the conversation. He looked like a man who hadn't slept well in longer than a week, and he didn't try to explain himself the way he had with Carol. He just told me straight out that he was sorry, that he understood sorry didn't undo what he'd let happen to me, and that he intended to pay back every dollar he'd taken, on a schedule he'd already worked out with a financial counselor he'd started seeing. I told him I appreciated him coming to say it to my face instead of through somebody else, and that the money mattered less to me than the fact that I'd trusted him for 15 years, and he'd let me carry the weight of what he'd done instead of just telling me the truth. He didn't have a good answer for that, and I didn't expect him to. Some things a man just has to sit with. The family didn't cut Greg out entirely, and I want to be honest that there was a part of me in the rawest days of all this that might have wanted that. But justice, real justice, isn't always the same thing as banishment. What we did instead was rebuild the fund with real oversight this time, a second signature required on anything over a small amount, statements automatically shared with all 3 of us. Instead of sitting quietly with one person's access, the kind of ordinary, unglamorous safeguard that should have been there from the beginning, if trust alone had ever been enough to keep something like this from happening. Greg still comes to Sunday dinners. He's quieter now, humbler in a way that isn't performance, and he's been making his payments on time every month without anybody having to ask. Ellen and I had our own conversation eventually, weeks later, just the 2 of us on her back porch with 2 cups of coffee going cold between us. She never quite managed a clean apology, not in so many words. That's not really who she is, but she told me in her own roundabout way that she'd been afraid for a long time of what looking too closely at Greg might mean, and that fear had made her careless with me in a way she was ashamed of now that she could see it plainly. I told her I understood fear making people careless. I'd watched my own father live his whole life underneath a kind of fear like that. It didn't erase what she'd done, but it helped me understand it, and understanding, I've found, is sometimes the closest thing to peace a person actually gets. Carol and I are different now, not broken, not exactly repaired either, but different in a way I think is better than what we had before, if I'm honest about it. We talk more than we used to about the ordinary running of our lives, the things I used to just quietly handle on my own without ever mentioning them. She asks now. I tell her, it's a small thing, but small things are what a marriage is actually built from, same as I said at the start of all this. She fixed that dripping pipe under the kitchen sink herself eventually, the one that had stumped her the second morning I was gone, called me at work just to tell me she'd figured it out on her own, and I could hear in her voice how much that had mattered to her, being able to say it. Not long after I moved back in, I replaced the lock on our front door, the same door I'd hung 20 years ago and never once had trouble with. There was nothing wrong with the old lock. I just wanted a new one, a small private thing between me and that door, a fresh start for the one piece of this house that had meant the most to me through all of it. I stood on the porch afterward, testing the key in the new lock, listening to it, catch clean and smooth the way a good lock should, and I thought about my father and about the promise I'd made to myself all those years ago in a church pew beside him. I'd kept it. It had cost me something to keep it, more than I expected going in. But standing there on my own porch with my own key turning easy in my own hand, I understood finally that some promises are worth exactly what they cost you, and not a penny less.